Imagine it. The year is 1885. King Leopold II of Belgium establishes the Congo as his own personal possession. Cremation starts happening for the first time in England, and the first group of Japanese arrive in Hawaii. Stateside, Mark Twain publishes The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. A doctor in Iowa performs the first appendectomy successfully. The first Forest Commission is started in California. The Salvation Army becomes official. Kellogg cereal is patented. And finally, the only president to ever marry in the White House is inaugurated. Grover Cleveland was the very first president who was part of the Democrat Party since before the Civil War. In his inaugural address, he vows to run the country like a business and adhere to his conservative views. Now, his first year of presidency was pretty quiet. Nothing really big happened until November, when he lost his vice president, Thomas Kendrick. For whatever reason, that prompted him to start thinking really hard about the line of succession. So, with that new motivation, he hit the new year running with a new bill in January called the Presidential Succession Act. And it was the act for, until right after World War II. But it specified how people planned to deal with things if we lost certain positions of power. So from the president, the vice president, secretary of state, and so on. In April, Cleveland becomes the very first president to speak to Congress on how important he thinks labor is to national prosperity. In fact, he believed there should be a particular committee that was dedicated to figuring out labor disputes. Soon after, he started doing some veto work. First, he vetoes a bill that keeps veterans of the Civil War from collecting disability, any type of disability, if their disability came after the war. He also cracked down on a lot of Civil War pensions that were filed fraudulently. But the big drama that started was between him and the railroads. See, there was a period of time, years back, that the railroads were given kind of like loans, where they are grants actually, where they could go and buy land, of course, to help build the railroads. And I guess he felt like there may have been some abuses there, so he ran an investigation. And that's when he found out that perhaps some of the land that was purchased by the railroads ought not to have been purchased by the railroads. So they were forced to give back 81 million acres of land. A few days after he did the vetoes for the Civil War stuff, he accepted the Statue of Liberty in person in New York. And then about a month later, he became the first president at 49 to marry in the White House to a 21-year-old named Frances Folsom. It was quite the event of the year. By the end of 1886, the American Federation of Labor was formed by Samuel Gompers. He was the son of immigrants from England, and we'll hear more about this in the future. By February of 87, Cleveland had had a little too much of the railroads. He thought they had gotten a little bit big for their britches, and he was over it. So in 87, he signed the Interstate Commerce Act, which was the first law made to regulate the railroads. And that went over well. 4 days later, the General Allotment Act became law, also known as the Dawes Act, which is named after the senator who came up with the idea. In theory, it was supposed to be something positive for the Native Americans. In fact, Grover Cleveland saw himself as a protector of the Native Americans, and he believed it was part of his duty to help sort of stop the anti-Native American sentiment and sort of help them assimilate into American culture. So The Dawes Act was meant what it all boiled down to was land, and that was the allotment part of the act. They were dividing up the land and giving it out, different amounts depending on family size. I'm gonna have to. It's such a big thing. I'm gonna do like a whole separate video on it. But the nice way to put it is the Dawes Act was a massive failure. Grover Cleveland came into the White House believing that no group should be deserving of special favors. So when it came time for him to sign off on a bill that passed that would send $10,000 worth of seeds to Texas because of the massive drought going on, it's supposed to help, the farmers get back on track. He vetoed it. And the reason was, and I quote, "Federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government and weakens the sturdiness of our national character." In other words, he expected the farmers in Texas who were suffering from a drought that was not their fault to just deal with it, get it together, and move forward. This is before the pick 'em up by your bootstraps thing came out, but it's the same vibe. And that may or may not have been why he decided to go on a tour of the South and Southwest that fall. Before Christmas of '87, Cleveland stood in front of Congress and basically asked them to do something about the incredibly high tariffs. And for whatever reason, the Republicans were able to take that and make it a talking point for the election coming up next year. And it ended up working for them. But he said that what's the point of getting elected or reelected if there's not something you stand for? So the talk that he had about labor before must have done something, because in the summer of '88, the Department of Labor was established. And a month before election, he signed the Chinese Exclusion Act into law, which simply stated that anyone who was living in America and were Chinese, if they left and went back to China, they weren't allowed to come back, even though maybe they were going to visit family. Who knows? They couldn't come back. Funny enough, Cleveland was actually a big fan of immigration. He was all for having people come from anywhere in the world and come here. I mean, that's why he loved the Statue of Liberty. He loved what it stood for. He loved that it was going to be the welcoming center for immigrants coming in. But he believed that the divide between Americans and the Chinese was too great. Now, remember when I said about the Native Americans? He was excited to help the Native Americans assimilate into American society. He believed that the divide was too great between American and Chinese. There was no way to get them to become less Chinese. He actually thought banning Chinese from moving to the United States was kind of protecting them because of all the anti-Chinese sentiment. So when the election came, Cleveland actually did get the popular vote, but he did not win the Electoral College, so therefore he was not reelected. But don't worry, he will be back. In fact, he's the only president to have ever done that. Before departing his office the first time, he created the Department of Agriculture and made North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington states. Tune in next time for when a new relative becomes president.